up is Kathy White. Kathy's the Regional Councillor for Taupo, the Waikato Regional Councillor for Taupo Rotorua and the Chair of the Environmental Services Performance Committee. Kathy loves learning about wildlife, and it's a passion she was shared by a zoologist father and mother who got her interested in animal welfare at a very early age. She's speaking about the unintended consequences of using a broad range of toxins on our ecosystem, particularly the implications for wildlife and waterways. Thank you, Kathy.
And Ian, sure, you did a fabulous job at introducing the topic. I mean, a lot of the things that actually I'd love to talk about. We could have days here talking about all kinds of things like toxicity of cypermethrin and just how awful Brodifficum is. And I had to decide, what would I rather talk to you about? Would I rather talk to you about 1080 or would I rather talk to you about Brodifficum? And it was a pretty hard choice, I have to say. But I wanted to talk to you about 1080 because it is a bit of a passion of mine. It's something that I talk quite a lot about in Waikato Regional Council. It's a little bit akin to hitting your head against a brick wall. When you are a councillor, you do find that when you raise some of these issues, they're quite difficult ones to raise within council. A lot of the time you're actually told that it's not something that you can influence a huge amount and that actually it's much more of a national conversation. But look, some of the things that I wanted to talk to you about today, some of the things you know already, so I'm not going to talk a huge amount about the humaneness of 1080, even though it's fairly clear that it's not a very humane death. You can tell by looking at any animal that you find out in the environment. If you're unlucky enough to actually find one that's in the process of dying, it's something you'll never forget, especially if you've seen a dog dying of 1080. If you've heard people's experiences of watching their own dog die of 1080, you suddenly become a warrior against the use of this toxin, I think, if you've experienced it. But also some of the unintended pathways. Obviously we're concerned about our kai, how it ends up in things that we hunt and gather, and also the fact that there are a whole load of species which are actually eaten by other wildlife as well as by us, who like these cereal baits, because we have to remember that actually it is a food that's being dropped into our forest, and it's a food which is attractive to all kinds of things. And we have an awful lot of birds. Originally with 1080 we were sold the idea that birds weren't attracted to 1080, and in fact that's still something which we're told quite a lot. But in fact most of our birds do end up consuming 1080 either in terms of it being a primary poisoning case where they eat the baits, or as secondary poisoning. So maybe they consume things like mice or rats, and in other cases invertebrates. So when you've got kiwi that are probing the ground for all kinds of worms, etc., and that invertebrates are contaminated, and that in fact a lot of people have put out warnings about not using 1080 in places where there are rare insectivores. And of course with examples like this just shows when you do leave poisoned carcasses out in the environment, the risks that are there. But look, we know that there are all of these risks. We know that 1080 gets dropped into most waterways, which do end up in a lot of our larger water bodies. And the thing is that it's a little bit of a slippery slope. In the past we've actually been worried about 1080 entering waterways. Now people say it either doesn't matter too much, or they say it's biodegradable, and that's the kind of thing that I think we need to have a lot more conversation about. But look, I want to talk today about some of the things that I think are wrong with the system that we have, in terms of a whole load of what I see as negative consequences and an attempt to prevent information about those negative consequences from being made available to the wider public. So I'm not going to be able to talk about all of these things today, but if there's something that you see in that list that you really want to ask a question about, then I encourage you to do so. But the things that I'm going to talk about specifically today are about 1080 being dropped into your water, the fact that a lot of people don't know what their rights are in terms of water, and that's just looking at things like buffers around waterways, things like water mitigation, that you're entitled to bottled water or tanker water when your water access point is actually being poisoned. Things like water testing, the whole thing around the fact that you used to take water tests at 8 hours and 24 hours. It used to be a condition of dropping 1080. That's disappeared. It's one of the things, again, that I think of when I talk about the slippery slope, that we no longer test at the time when it's most likely that you'll get a positive result. And the reason why I think that's important is because for me it's a little bit like saying that when you test a drunk driver, when you test his blood alcohol, if you test it 24 hours after he's consumed and driven, and you gather all of those negative tests into a database and say that that proves it's safe to drink and drive, I feel that it's a little bit like this. If you're not testing at a time when you're most likely to get a positive result, you don't actually know that 1080's been present in that waterway, you don't know that it's been taken up by the watercress and by the cobra and by all of the organisms that are in that particular water body. So I'm going to talk a little bit about water. I want to talk about 1080 residues in Kiwi, the fact that we've only tested 3 Kiwi in 20 years for 1080, and I want to talk about a couple of case studies to do with Kiwi. I also really want to talk about the fact that birds, so chicks and eggs, are being translocated from unpoisoned areas like Te Urewera and taken to poisoned places, which I feel is skewing the data. And I think it's very important that we have accurate data to be able to make good quality decisions. And also the one that I really want to talk about today is the fact that I've identified a lot of poison operations that haven't been reported to the EPA, or where the details of livestock deaths and dog deaths haven't been reported to the EPA. And I feel that these are all examples of where information is being hidden. And I think it's very important that we call them out every time we find out these things. We have to really push to make sure that people are as transparent as possible. So just talking about water, because in New Zealand a lot of people actually draw water from their local stream. Now if you live in a city, this probably is a strange concept to you, but if you live somewhere like the Coromandel Peninsula, for instance, huge numbers of people actually have pipes and streams, and they're drawing their water for their livestock and for themselves from streams. And you're entitled to do that. You don't have to be registered to do that. You're perfectly entitled to do that. But if you're not registered, it's like you're this invisible person. Nobody knows that they need to talk to you when something like a 1080 drop happens. So this thing called a permission document is released through the district health boards. And basically this identifies all the conditions for which they can drop something like 1080. And condition 25 says that households drawing water from within 3 kilometres of the operational area are entitled to mitigation. So what that might mean is, you might be entitled to bottled water, you might be entitled to tanker water, you might also be able to ask for a buffer around your particular waterway. But the thing is, you're also entitled to further notification. What happens normally is that when a 1080 drop is about to happen, you'll get a public notice in the paper, but that might tell you it's going to happen within the next couple of months. It doesn't tell you when it's going to happen, because a lot of it's weather dependent. If you're someone who's not a registered water take, you won't be told. You won't be told anything apart from what is in that public notice. So you won't know the day of the drop, and you won't know that you should pull your water pipe out of the stream. You also don't know that you were entitled to some bottled water or some tanker water. Most people, we have found, for instance on the Coromandel Peninsula, were drawing their water completely unknowing of the fact that the drop was happening, and they were giving this water to their livestock and their families. So on here you can see numbers. These were registered water takes. So these are the people who were actually told on the day of the drop. They knew that they shouldn't drink the water from the stream. But we found, for instance, that there were hundreds of people in this particular drop who were unregistered, who had no idea. We found, for instance, one man who was drawing water for 80 households, and those 80 households were supplying water for their livestock. And he was extremely concerned to find he'd been doing that through the entire 1080 operation. So when we pointed it out, yes?
Is there any registration for people collecting water off their roofs?
So
the dust that gets on the roof will have 1080 in it?
So
can I register against?
You can register. You can register to make sure that you get notified.
Because I can smell at the very end of the drop on nearby. I could smell something odd in the air. So I would have had it on my roof.
My recommendation is that if you know that there's a 1080 drop happening in your area, that you register. But I guess the point here is this is the response from the Department of Conservation, that it wasn't a requirement from the Waikato District Health Board for us to walk all streams to find unregistered water intakes. So there can be all those people out there who the Department of Conservation haven't spoken to, and they have continued to draw their water. Now the thing is, it is actually a concern to have it in your water. It says on the safety data sheet that you should take measures to minimise the chance of baits accidentally entering any body of water. It's certainly not something that you would be encouraged to do, but over time the recommendations around 1080 water have, in terms of the warnings, it's become less. It often says in the material that's sent out by people like Osprey that it's completely biodegradable. Now I think the issue of biodegradation, there is a huge difference in places, as Ian mentioned. If you're in a cold place, if you're in a dry place, biodegradation can take a long time, and there are also some things about that. In that biodegradation process, you also get a whole load of things that are produced at the same time. But look, this is really just to show you, this is a toxic flight chart which shows you all those red lines where the poison was dropped. This was Mount Pirongia. All waterways were poisoned apart from the public drinking water intake, which had a buffer around it. But there were farms all around here, and all these streams were actually going down Mount Pirongia and feeding people's waterways. So I think there is this belief that people avoid water. They only really avoid the larger water bodies. And in my council, we were told it wasn't possible to avoid waterways, especially when you're dropping over forestry. Now this is really just pointing out to you that councils do try to actually minimise the effects of things like 1080 on public health and on the environment. Our council, this was a unanimous decision that was made in December 2015, and this was to include within the scope of the regional plan review the issue of protecting waterways from 1080, because we'd had numerous things come up, for instance in the Coromandel Peninsula, where we realised a lot of people's water was being poisoned. But what happens sometimes when councils bring in these resolutions, so for instance we also brought in this one, we wanted to add a point there, the one at the bottom that says that poison baits and carcasses may be present in waterways. We brought all of these things in, and then the government brought in the exemption regulations, which means that resource consents aren't issued by councils anymore. And we think this was probably in reaction to the fact that there were councils around the country that were trying to bring in change that would help people, at least educate people about the risks in their environment. Now look, I just want to talk briefly about the fact that there are a lot of deaths happening around New Zealand, incidental deaths to do with 1080. This was on one farm, 252 sheep and lambs in Ratanui. So the Southland Regional Council negotiated with the landowner, and it was a confidential agreement with the landowner. And the landowner did actually release the information later, which is how it ended up in the Poisoning Paradise documentary. But I think this is really just something I want to alert you to, that there are a lot of arrangements, private arrangements that happen after there have been livestock deaths. And for instance, at the moment, in my region, in the Waikato region, I'm investigating 6 incidents at the moment in the King Country alone. So you probably know about the Mapara incident with the cattle deaths and the stillborn calves, but I've identified a whole load of others that have never been reported to the EPA. I only know because farmers contact me directly, and unfortunately the one that I went to recently, I discovered it was my own council that hadn't reported it to the EPA. Well, it concerns me because we need to know what the risks are out there. We need to know how many animals are dying. Yes. And one of the other reasons we really need to know this kind of thing is that there are people out there who are consuming products which are in our food chain. So you probably know about the Indian family from Aotearoa who ate wild boar that had been given to them by a local pig hunter. Okay, there were a load of things that perhaps should have indicated to people that it was 1080 poisoning. The pig hunter's dog, for instance, had died soon after the pig had been caught. There were 3 family members who ended up in hospital, and the very first working diagnosis was that it was 1080 or some other kind of rodenticide used in pest control. Now, even though it was the very first diagnosis, no one tested for it in the curry, in the frozen pork that was left over, or in the patients. And in fact, it was promoted that it was most likely to be botulism through the media. That's all the media talked about, was botulism, even though all of their symptoms looked like 1080 poisoning. They did eventually test for 1080 in the patient's urine, but they did it 18 days after that they'd been hospitalised, which was too late. You couldn't get a valid result. So I guess from my perspective, it's these kinds of things which I feel data which we really need to demonstrate what the real risks are with 1080 aren't always being gathered, and that concerns me. So Aaroni and Shaw actually did write a letter. He helped me quite a bit by writing a letter which said that, that in his opinion, the affected members of the family's symptoms are consistent with 1080 and not botulism poisoning. And he did find the investigative strategy for this case somewhat awry. So look, there are a whole load of things that I would like to point out, and I'll do it very quickly. But for instance, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment said only 8 dogs have died in 4 years from 1080 poisoning. And yet another study that was done by the National Poison Centre with Otago University, where they contacted 125 vets randomly, they had less than 50% response, but of the ones who responded, and it showed that over 65 dogs had died in a single year. And they said that the number was probably a fraction of the likely total, because most people don't take their dogs to the vet when they're poisoned. This particular case is, this was a restoration report that was put out to do with Mount Bruce, Pukaha. The reason I want to raise this with you is that their restoration report made this statement. So the success of the pest control project has enabled the reintroduction of these bird species into the reserve area, and these species have significantly benefited from ongoing pest control, with the resident populations of all species increasing. This is an example of when you need to when you read things like this, you need to ask questions, and you need to send in Official Information Act requests that really sort of target when these generalised statements are made. Because what you need to know is that 120 Kiwi were introduced to Mount Bruce, and these are the ones that were monitored. The Kiwi that were reported as dead or missing, presumed dead, were 110 plus. In actual fact, there were only, the statistics are quite complicated when you look at them, because they also have some free-ranging individuals that aren't monitored. But what they said was there were only 4 that were known to still be alive out of those 120 that had been monitored. Now at this place, there is a lot of pest control, probably more pest control than anywhere else in the country. They've had 4 1080 drops over a period of 5 years. Wow. Before that, 1080 was hand laid. They have every kind of anticoagulant imaginable there in 1,100 bait stations across 942 hectares. Wow. These are some of the pesticides that they've used over the last 10 years. In 2010, 6 kaka died within 1 month of suspected bait station poisoning. So there is evidence that that bird species there are being poisoned by some of the toxins that are being used. So you would think that they might have tested some of these kiwi for toxin residues, but they don't. They don't test them at all for toxin residues. And this is the kind of thing that I find quite hard, because all over the country in places like Tongariro National Park, we're using the same strategies and we're getting similar results. But what happens is that the results of these places, they're reported as predation, that kiwi have died through predation, without us actually testing them to find whether there's any residues of toxin in there that might have incapacitated them in any way. And it is important because kiwi are known to eat cereal baits, and we also know that they eat coda, and we know that they eat all those invertebrates. And this is just to show you what has happened around Mount Bruce. They've done so much pest control, and their mustelid tracking reports show that they didn't have stoats there. But what's happened when you get rid of all of those pests is the farmland around Pukaha got completely invaded by rabbits. The farmers all started complaining, all started saying, you know, we need more pest control, which is what happens. It's a bit of a vicious cycle. But the other thing is, when you get a whole load of rabbits suddenly on farmland, is you suddenly attract pests from outside in. So they've had a lot of ferrets seen around Pukaha in recent years. So it's a much more complicated thing than you realise when you engage in a pest control strategy. So just as a contrast, looking at Ōkahu Valley, which is in the Whirinaki Forest Park, now that's adjacent to Te Urewera National Park. Got to remember, Tūhoi don't use 1080, they're really against 1080. This is the area that I mentioned before, which looks beautiful, doesn't it? Great habitat, actually. Great habitat for kiwi. This was an Official Information Act request that showed that that they haven't used any 1080, so ridgeline to ridgeline throughout this valley. The kiwi population is really healthy. You can go into that valley and you'll hear kiwi at night. It's quite a fabulous experience. But what's been happening is that kiwi eggs and chicks are being taken out of the Ōkahu Valley, and they've never returned any. And you have to think to yourself, there is obviously a healthy breeding population of kiwi in this area. Why would you remove them when they're doing so well? But also their statistics in this area are probably quite important to us, because we don't have a lot of places that are unpoisoned anymore. These are just a few things at the end I want to point out to you, and would really encourage you to challenge them every time you see them. So this was actually published in my local community paper, that the Waikato Regional Councillor had said that no kiwi, kakariki or falcons have been found dead after 1080 drops. Okay, so it depends on the way you phrase things sometimes, doesn't it? But I challenged my council on this, because I said there's a whole load of unpublished research that talks about kakariki having 1080 residues in them. So dead chicks in a failed nest contain 1080 residues. 2 unmonitored kakariki were found dead with 1080 residues in their tissues. Sometimes this information is not made readily available, and these blanket statements are made on regional council websites and government websites, and we have to challenge them at every opportunity, I feel. So that's all that I have to say. something in my list of things I'd love to talk to you about that you want to ask, please do so at the end, because I'd love to talk about some